Good morning. Great to be here, and great to be here with Congressman Schiff. You have a mic right there. We're going to have a whole rip-roaring conversation, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. And we're not on TV, so we don't have to be as formal. Your committee is making news. Congressman Schiff, as everyone knows, is chair of the Intelligence Committee, a former federal prosecutor, among other things. And you have a breakthrough with the Justice Department this morning. What is it?
Well, we had been a series of negotiations over getting the underlying materials, the documents behind the Mueller report, and in many respects, those materials are more important than the mere redactions in the report because they go to what witnesses said, the details of the investigative tactics that were used, and the particular interest that we have is in the counterintelligence and foreign intelligence information, because the investigation, after all, began not as a criminal probe, but as a counterintelligence probe into whether people around Trump and then Trump himself were acting as witting or unwitting agents of a foreign power. So as part of the negotiations, we said, look, here are 12 sets of documents that we want. They're identified in the report. None of these are even arguably privileged in any way. All of these involve counterintelligence or foreign intelligence information. Start by providing these, or we're going to go to an enforcement action. This was a test of whether they were acting in good faith or without any faith. And close to midnight last night, they finally agreed, okay, we'll provide those documents as the initial set of what we hope will be a rolling production. So that's a positive step.
On the 12, you haven't publicly identified what they are.
We have not.
But your description suggests it's, for example, presumably not grand jury material, but could be other underlying evidence that informed the intelligence parts of the probe?
Yes. You know, if you look at any number of the incidents that are reflected in the report, there's intelligence behind them that goes into far more detail. And, you know, just to give you illustrations of the kind of thing without saying whether this is implicated in these documents or not, we know that Manafort was giving polling data to someone linked to Russian intelligence. We know very little about that.
And is that a totally normal thing?
In this campaign, the answer would be yes, apparently. And, you know, discussing election targeting in the Midwest and whatnot. A lot of the chapters, or really sub-chapters in the report, are not fleshed out beyond very summary descriptions and conclusions. And so what we're predominantly interested in is, where did the counterintelligence investigation lead? We don't even know at this point whether it's still ongoing or whether it was closed at some point. We do know from the Mueller report that periodically FBI agents who were embedded in the Mueller team would send findings back to headquarters. And those fall into two categories, those that directly related to Russia and the election. And then there was another category of things that didn't relate to the election, but nonetheless could compromise our country. And, you know, to give you the paramount example of a counterintelligence issue, which is discussed in the report, and that was the effort by Donald Trump to build Moscow Trump Tower during the campaign, the lies about it, and the fact that they sought to get the Kremlin's help to make it happen. And here, and this is, you know, kind of astonishing, a year later, when it's disclosed that even though the president had been saying no dealings with Russia, no business deals, blah, 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 that in fact he'd been seeking to make the most lucrative deal of his life and seeking Kremlin help, when that became public a year later, that they'd made outreach to Dmitry Peskov, this guy close to Putin at the Kremlin, Peskov issued a statement saying, we never followed up on those inquiries. That was a lie. And so here you had the Kremlin covering up for lies of the President of the United States. So you can imagine what counterintelligence and compromise concerns that kind of behavior raises.
And so in a room like this, people are familiar with what's been happening in Washington, what the storylines are. Most of the storylines in the relationship between a relatively new Democratic House of Representatives and the White House are of stonewalling, are of alleged obstruction, are of people blowing through even typical oversight hearings, defying subpoenas, refusing to show up and testify. Why today are you making news with your committee getting what looks to be progress from the Justice Department? Is there something you're doing right? Are your underlying statutes stronger? Or are you at risk of being played by Attorney General Barr? What is your view?
We don't know whether this kind of last-minute decision to comply is tactical or whether this is indicative of the thinking at the Justice Department that ultimately they're going to lose on these issues. It may be a result, for example, it may be influenced by the Mazur court opinion earlier in the week, which not only rejected a lot of the same arguments that the Justice Department and Trump administration have been making, that there's no legislative purpose or that it has to be somehow set out specifically what bill you're going to introduce as a result of your oversight. Of course, that's a completely false reading of our oversight authorities. So it may be a result of the Mazur court saying basically the legal equivalent of get out of my court. That argument makes no sense whatsoever.
So let me push you on that. If that's door number one, that the DOJ is adjusting in response to an adverse court ruling, why only then giving ground to the Intelligence Committee and not also the Judiciary Committee?
Well, my hope is that they will give ground in all of these committees. And what we're doing, we've made it clear to the Justice Department, doesn't obviate the need for them to comply with the rest of our document requests. This is just the first. It also doesn't mean that an enforcement action against Don McGahn should not go forward. It should, or Bill Barr. The actions the Judiciary Committee is taking are very important. None of those are mitigated by compliance with a different committee on a different issue. We have different statutory authorities. The National Security Act provides that counterintelligence and foreign intelligence information must be given to our committee upon request. In that respect, the statutes for our committee look a lot like the statute in the Ways and Means Committee regarding the President's tax returns. Now, does the recognition that we have a solid legal basis for our request in our committee mean they're suddenly going to comply with Richie Neal's request? Probably not.
So tell us a little bit, although some people have worked on the Hill obviously in this room and know about it, but tell us how it works with your fellow chairs. I mean, we're hearing this morning that you're getting more breakthrough on some of the same underlying Mueller evidence than Chairman Nadler. So do you guys compare notes? Are you saying, well, you know, Barr called me back, he didn't call me. You know, he said to me that Mueller was snitty, but then to you, he wouldn't even say anything. I mean, how do you guys compare that? And yes, we're in a town where people sometimes make it too much about personalities, but it does look like you right now are on better terms with the Barr Justice Department than the Judiciary Committee.
I don't know whether we're on better terms or not. But in answer to your question in terms of how the committees are operating, Chairman Nadler, Chairman Cummings, Chairwoman Waters, Chairman Neal, and others, we discuss what we're doing constantly. The chairs meet constantly. We meet with our leadership constantly so that we keep each other abreast of what we're doing, what we're hearing, so that we cannot be played off against each other, so that our legal strategies are harmonized, so that we're making the same arguments in court. And obviously, for example, the Mazur's accounting case is a oversight committee case. But it's very similar to the case that we're making along with financial services for the Deutsche Bank records, which is going to be heard, actually it's being heard right now. And we are obviously making the judge in that a different judge than in the Mazur case, well aware of what the court has ruled in the Mazur case. We're making the same arguments, we're urging the same accelerated timetable. So we are making sure that we have a harmonized legal strategy as well as a political strategy, and having the same lawyer, the same office of general counsel handling all this litigation obviously facilitates that.
And one of the ways you talk, of course, is through these caucus meetings. There was a major one scheduled this morning. Speaker Pelosi, of course, is going to be here at CAP later. And we understand there's certain aspects of that you're not going to get into. But do you walk out of that meeting this morning feeling that Democrats are closer to impeachment proceedings or not?
You know, obviously I don't want to go into the discussions in caucus, but look, I think our members are, you know, much like where the American people are on impeachment, and that is there is a variety of opinions about whether now is the time, whether we need to do more oversight work before we get to that point, what the ultimate repercussion would be of going forward with an impeachment, knowing what the result would look like in the Senate. There isn't unanimity about that, but there is unanimity about this, and that is the administration is engaged in a wholesale cover-up.
Right, and we've talked about some of that, but is there a world where Speaker Pelosi reconsiders based on the caucus and launches an impeachment probe, or is that really not in the cards, in your view as a chair?
I don't know that I would characterize it as reconsiders. I think her view is we need to do our oversight work, and if we get to the point where we've developed the factual record where that makes sense, then we go forward. We have to keep in mind this is about what's best for the country. And I think what she is weighing is knowing where this would end up. Do we put the country through a divisive experience of an impeachment? Is that the best thing for the country? And she is weighing against that the whole set of priorities that Hakeem just talked to you about, or talked to your colleague about. What does that mean in terms of our healthcare agenda? What does that mean in terms of prescription drugs and infrastructure and the other issues that we're working on? So, that is what we want our speaker to be weighing.
And let me ask you one more piece on that, and then we'll move on. I'm curious, by a show of hands here, how many people in this room have worked on advocacy or legislation that you didn't think ultimately was likely to happen, likely to pass, likely to become law? And then there's a few people who don't have their hands up who are just super effective and only do winning things. Those are the DJ Khaled people in the room. All they do is win. They've never worked on something else. I see you with your hands down, and I don't believe you. And this is, as you know, as a prosecutor, what we call a leading question. But I'm leading for a reason, which is there is a legitimate and substantive argument against proceeding to impeachment, and we've heard that laid out. Then there is this other argument that you didn't directly say, but I think you've gestured towards, and certainly the speaker has said, which is, well, if it's not going to have the outcome that you would support if you were for impeachment in the Senate, then why do it? And I think the answer would obviously be what we saw in the room, that this town and social change and movements and politics is full of things that start out unlikely, like, say, a reality star real estate developer running for president and being laughed out of the room, and then become likely. So do you give any credence to that argument that the reason not to do it is that you won't win over Senate Republicans, or do you have a different argument to the extent you do against it?
Well, look, obviously, I don't think the analogy of whether you try to offer a bill and you have to be certain that it's going to pass before you do is a particularly good analogy. You might.
And just briefly, when one person with a JD tells another that it's a bad analogy, that is a withering rejection. But go on,
well,
sir.
I've used another analogy which people have also taken issue with, and it's also an imperfect analogy, and that is how many of you are former prosecutors who indicted someone in the knowledge that you would be unsuccessful in trying to prove the case to a jury? Probably none of you. And indeed, one of the things that Mueller points out in his report is on the issue of conspiracy, the Justice Department guidelines required him only to move forward, and even then not fully move forward, if he felt he could prove all of the elements beyond a reasonable doubt before a jury. I do think that notwithstanding all of that, that there is a valid argument to be made that if you fail to bring an impeachment, even knowing it would be unsuccessful, but if you fail to bring an impeachment, what does that say about this president's conduct and whether he is fit for office? And so I do think that has to be weighed, though, against the other concern, which is what does an acquittal say? Because then you have an adjudication that this conduct is not an impeachable offense. And that is the dilemma that we are stuck between. Both are equally unpalatable. And you know, I think that we do a disservice to each other if we diminish the significance of this debate. And there are good and valid points, and one of the ones that has resonated with me among the pro-impeachment arguments is if they do continue to completely stonewall the Congress, if they obstruct the Congress the way they obstructed the investigation, that really raises the ante. And then maybe we need the most vigorous response to that, even if it ultimately doesn't prevail. I'm not there yet, but I don't want to exclude the possibility either if they continue this kind of lawlessness.
I believe you drew applause for both sides of the nuanced argument, which is very Talmudic.
Well,
there's
you know, as they say in my line of work, I have friends on both sides of this issue, and I stand firmly with my friends.
So we've dug into all that, and that's where your committee was making news. There's a lot of other issues that you work on that I also want to get to now. So turning the page, when did you first learn that the president was seriously considering pardoning more than one convicted war criminal, a story that broke in the New York Times recently?
Well, probably like most folks when it broke in the New York Times.
And what was your first reaction?
My first reaction is that this is classic Donald Trump thinking, that this would score political points, but at a cost of sending a message that disregarding orders, murdering people in violation of the laws of conflict is something that can be excused if it's politically advantageous. And the damage that would do in terms of our standing in the world, the damage it would do in terms of the ability to maintain discipline among forces if they believe they can ignore the rules of engagement, ignore the morality that, yes, is challenged in combat, the damage it would do, I think, would be incalculable. It's one thing if you were to decide as the President of the United States that someone that had been brought up even on a war crime charge had been, for some reason, after vetting by the Department of Justice and thorough examination, deserving of a reprieve. That is not apparently what's happening here. What's happening here is a wholesale view of whether we should simply, and for the most transparently political reasons, pardon anyone who has been accused of some of the most serious wartime offenses.
Do you think it sends a message to enlisted officers and soldiers that, as the Trump White House has suggested, or at least his allies have suggested, that this means they will be thought of and quote-unquote protected no matter what? Or do you think it sends a message that undercuts U.S. national security?
Well, I think it certainly undercuts U.S. national security. I mean, imagine the reaction around the world if the president pardons people who have committed murder in the way that they were charged. What that would mean to, for example, if these offenses were committed in Iraq, what that would mean in terms of our relationship with the Iraqi government, the Iraqi people, and also what it means, and again, this is like the argument against torture, what it means in terms of American service members and the military forces of other countries. So there's no, I think, good way to look at this. And of course, it is not happening in isolation either, because it's taking place when the president is pardoning people for other obviously political reasons, such as they're conservative and they wrote a book talking about how great Trump is. Or they're a sheriff who was part of the birther conspiracy and stuck with Trump. I mean, this is basically our president's message about everything. If you say nice things about me, if you have my back, I will have yours. The law be damned. It is just part and parcel of the most serious attack on the rule of law and our democracy, certainly in my lifetime.
What do you do with the riddle that, on the one hand, the pardon power, like other national security powers of the commander-in-chief, it's not completely unreviewable, but I think we would agree it's close. It's an incredibly powerful unitary option. And yet we have a president who is actually so responsive to the media, to public pressure, to, as you just alluded to, his own general vanity, if you want to call it that, the fact that this leaked in the Times and then sparks a debate over whether it is quote-unquote, I don't mean to oversimplify, but part of the debate has been, is that quote-unquote pro-military military or not, may actually be the thing that prevents him from doing it. Do you, in your role, obviously you have a very serious security role, but do you also and your colleagues think about, okay, how do we use that lever to prevent a thing that might be negative, because you're almost certainly not going to prevent or override that pardon once it's issued?
Well, the pardon power, like any power in the Constitution, is not absolute. And you see this absolutist argument made in many contexts. You see now and I hesitate to call him the Attorney General, he's really more the personal attorney for the president. But you see the argument
What do you mean by that? You don't think he deserves the title anymore?
No. I think Bill Barr has all the duplicity of Rudy Giuliani without the good looks and a general likability of Rudy Giuliani. Well, I mean, the most dangerous thing I think that Bill Barr has done is basically say that a president under investigation can make the investigation go away if he thinks it's unfair, which, by the way, means the other 14 investigations farmed out to other offices he can also make go away. But it also means that if you want to fire the FBI director because he's not doing what you want, he's not going easy on Michael Flynn or some other friend of yours or some other witness who might incriminate you, that you have an absolute right to do it. There's nothing absolute about it. The fact that the president has the right to fire an FBI director doesn't mean he has the right to fire one for an improper reason, any more than an employer who has an at-will employee can fire them because they reject their sexual advances. That's not how the law works. It's not how the Constitution works. And in the pardon context, if the court were to interpret the power of the pardon as absolute, it would mean that a president could instruct people, like Arpaio or others, to violate the law on his behalf and say, don't worry, if you get arrested, I will simply pardon you. You know, to paraphrase one of our justices, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And to interpret it in this way would be self-defeating. It would mean that the president is above the law, that we are no longer a system of checks and balances. So there are ways that we can meaningfully constrain abuse of it. I've introduced a bill which would require that if the president pardons someone in a case in which he is a witness, target, or subject, or his family is, the entire investigative files will be provided to the Congress. That may not prevent the issuance of that pardon, but it will deter its abuse. And there are other steps like that that we can take to chill its abuse. But I do think that, like every other power in the Constitution, there are limits to it, and the abuse of it is unlawful, and of course the abuse of it can also, if we have a Congress that is beholden and dutiful to the Constitution and not simply the person of the president, can remove that president from office for violating those standards.
A couple other topics before we go to questions from the audience. Iran, in your role, including the intelligence you see that we don't, number one, factually, how grave a security threat is Iran to the United States and its allies, which is sort of what should we know? And then second, the part that often gets collapsed into that, given your view of the threat, what is the right way to contain it right now, and what is your view of the administration's approach?
Well, you know, I have to say, and there's been a lot of discussion about what does the intelligence show about the Iranian threat. In many respects, I think, not your question, but I think that question is the wrong question. I think the more important question...
I'm a television news anchor. I do that all the time.
I think
it's like a specialty.
I think the more important question is, how did we get here? Because the steps that have been taken over the last 2 years that began with a president who refused to keep certifying that Iran was in compliance with the agreement, even though Iran was in compliance with the agreement.
But let me push you, because I want to hear that, but I'm asking about the facts precisely because many people who sat where you sat have said, oh gosh, there's a lot here. I mean, what if you were going to put it on a scale of 0, Canada, to 10, what is your view, or what should we know about the actual threat? And then yes, let's hear your view of what they're doing.
The threat from Iran is increased over what it was a month ago. which is increased over what it was a year ago and 2 years ago. Now, I think some of the steps that we are taking and have taken are increasing the risk, not decreasing it. And this, to me, is the most important point, and that is, if you take actions over time that you know the result of which will be to increase the likelihood of hostilities, then why should you be surprised that the intelligence now shows you there's an increased chance of hostilities? You should be surprised if it were otherwise.
Do you think there are people in the Trump administration who actually want to make the threat worse to then drive towards a clash that they're pursuing?
I don't know whether it's the case that this is a deliberate march to war by people who are just eager for a full-on conflict with Iran, or whether this is simply the product of people like Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Bolton and others that think that belligerence is a strategy and a method worth of value in and of itself, who don't think about what the end goal is except in a kind of a dreamlike way. Because I've never gotten an adequate answer to the question, how will our leaving the agreement, how will our forcing Europe to leave the agreement, how will our forcing Iran to leave the agreement and go back to enriching improve our national security? What is a realistic expectation of where this leads other than to conflict or a nuclear-armed Iran? I've never gotten a serious answer to that question. And the reason, I think, is there is no good answer to that question, except for maybe a philosophical belief that if you act tough and sound tough, that maybe good things will follow. But the idea that this maximum pressure campaign, which I would more aptly describe as a maximum belligerence campaign, is somehow going to cause the mullahs to say, okay, you got us. Let's completely renegotiate the agreement that we were complying with and you reneged on, and we'll give you everything that you want. That is so, I think, pie in the sky that proceeding down that path with no expectation of success means that we're just proceeding down a path where the likelihood of conflict is that much greater. And I think that's where we are.
The final thing I want to ask you about before we go to questions relates to trying to get ahead of the efforts to use propaganda to sow discord or disrupt our deliberative process in America. And some of these efforts are more sophisticated than ever. And your committee has been looking at that, which is very interesting. And so one way to do this, I'm just curious, because I wasn't very familiar with this in scanning your hearing schedule. How many people in the room have heard of this term, deep fakes? Pretty good room, and that's still a minority. And yet, part of what you're arguing is that it is precisely learning about this and having some sort of attitude inoculation that may help us. So what are deep fakes? Why are you holding hearings on it? What do you hope to achieve? What should we, and particularly policymakers in the room, know?
Before I answer that, Ari, if I can just make one last point on Iran, and that is the fact that this has been the wrong path for us to leave the agreement and take these other steps doesn't mean that there wasn't another way to be tough on Iran. There was, and there is. That would have made much more sense. Iran is a malignant, malevolent actor and a great danger to the region and ultimately to us. But had we stayed in the agreement and focused our enforcement actions on going after their sponsorship of terror, their use of these terror proxies, their development of their missile program, we would have been united with Europe in containing the Iranian threat. Instead, the effect has been we are isolated, not Iran. We are at odds with our allies, not Iran. And ultimately, none of that makes us safer. If you ask the intelligence agencies whether this was predictable, I think that's a very important question. If you ask them, are we safer today than we were a year ago or 2 years ago, that is an important question, and maybe a more important question than does the intelligence tell us now we're at a heightened risk of conflict. In terms of deep fakes, back in 2016, when we were watching the Russians interfere in real time and they were dumping these stolen documents, the predominant fear I had was that they would start dumping fakes among the real documents, that they would take a real email between two Clinton people and insert an additional paragraph suggesting they were engaged in illegality. Once that document was released into the social media ecosystem, you could corroborate the fact that these two people were actual real people and they were in touch with each other, and much of the substance of the email could be corroborated, and it would lend additional credibility to the fraudulent paragraph suggesting illegality. There would be no way to disprove that in the run-up to the election. That was my biggest fear. Going forward into the next election, there's this new technology called deep fake technology that allows you to produce very easily and very inexpensively highly realistic, almost indistinguishable from real, fake video and fake audio, which means that at any time the Russians or anyone else could insert into the social media ecosystem at multiple places at multiple times and with a fairly good anonymization, a video of Joe Biden saying something he never said, or of Beto O'Rourke, or of Donald Trump, and the ability to show the electorate that this is false would be almost impossible. You can see a situation in which a completely fraudulent video of Joe Biden is released, and there are good experts on television saying how you can see from this indicia, and when we run the algorithms from that indicia, how this is not how Joe Biden speaks, or he's blinking the wrong percentage of times, or whatever. And on Fox News, they would have their experts saying, this is unquestionably real. And you add to that the converse problem, which is real material gets labeled as fake, which our president is already doing. And we end up in a world where the truth is now so difficult to ascertain that people just fall back on their tribe and their political party, and it doesn't matter whether something is real anymore. And it's hard to imagine something more corrosive to a democracy than an environment in which the truth doesn't matter anymore.
It sounds terrible. Does it make you want to just retire to a beach? Try something else?
No, it doesn't. But I will share this anecdote with you apropos of nothing, except that you do need a little levity now and then, given what's going on. I was in your hometown last week visiting my daughter, and we were walking down the street in the Upper West Side. And I was in blue jeans and a canvas jacket, and I was wearing sunglasses, and I thought pretty unrecognizable. But I was still getting stopped, which was irritating to my daughter, particularly when it got to the point where somebody asked her to hold their beer while we took a picture.
Does your daughter know how powerful you are? Probably not.
She said, what am I, the beer holder now? But after the third time I was stopped, I turned to her and I said, Alexa, I'm kind of shocked that people recognize me looking like this. And without missing a beat, she says, well, Dad, it's the pencil neck.
Well, your family keeps you grounded always.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Thank you to Congressman Schiff. We will take some brief questions. We have mics, as you all know. Please state your name, your affiliation, and a good rule of thumb is if it ends with a question mark, it's a question. Or right here, right by you.
Hi, Congressman, thank you for your service. My name is Diane Wachtel, and I started a group called Lawyers United to support the legal groups working on the rule of law in the country. I heard you say that you thought that some of the progress you made this morning might have been due to an adverse court ruling, and the administration changed their stance. And I understand that you feel that if the administration defies congressional subpoenas, the stakes may go up. Do you have the sense that they might defy a court ruling, and what would happen then?
Well, that's a very good question. And, we had a debate a week or two ago about whether we were in a constitutional crisis or not. I think we were at the precipice of one. We would be in a full-blown crisis if the court ordered the administration to take action to provide documents, make witnesses available, and the administration simply refused. Now, it's one thing to refuse pending appeal if the court stays the ruling. But if the court doesn't stay the ruling, and the refusal is simply a violation of court order, much like they are violating the constitutional obligation to provide the Congress, they would now be ignoring yet another branch of government, then I think you are in a full-blown crisis, because how does that get resolved? So, you know, I do think those circumstances would certainly be another grounds for impeachment. But at the end of the day, it still leaves us asking, where is Howard Baker? There is no Howard Baker. Now, Justin Amash, I give him credit. He's had more guts than any other GOP member of the House or Senate. I remember talking with John McCain before the midterms, and I think in one of the last conversations we had, and marveling at why isn't there a single Republican in the House or Senate who feels they have a constituency to be the John McCain of the House? You know, why is that? I would think that'd be a good place for any number of my colleagues to be. And his answer was, well, if it stays that way, they'll soon be calling you chairman. And up until this week, it did stay that way. And I think it was a courageous thing for Justin Amash to do. Whether you agree or you don't agree, the fact that he is willing to risk his seat shows a lot of the courage of that conviction. And that has been in very short supply. You know, we all have known, I think, intuitively that courage is contagious, but so is cowardice. And I think there's been a real contagion of cowardice. If the Congress of the United States won't stand up and defend its power of the purse against this bogus claim of an emergency, and then what chance is there we will defend any of the other institutions? So I'm grateful for what Justin Amash has done. I hope others will find their voice, because what really has our republic trembling right now is not just the lack of ethics and character of the President of the United States and his anti-democratic inclinations, but the fact that one party has made itself a cult of his personality, utterly unwilling to stand up to him. And that really is what has our democracy trembling.
Thank you.
Why don't we come to the middle here?
Hi, Mark Aronchik from Philadelphia. On the courage theme, can you give us some insights on what happened to Rod Rosenstein, who seemed to be independent and somewhat courageous and suddenly folded? And in that vein, are similar things from your perspective happening in the Southern District or in some of the other places where there supposedly are investigations that are going on?
You know, it's a very good question. During the last session of Congress, the Republicans in Congress sought documents in the Clinton email investigation and documents in the Mueller investigation, and they subpoenaed the Justice Department, and the Justice Department ended up providing over 1 million documents. By June of last year, they sent me a letter saying that to date they had provided 880,000 documents. Now, that was the same Justice Department led by Rod Rosenstein that has refused all of our requests until last night, and also under Rod Rosenstein. And when they were in the process of turning all these materials over last session, I raised this issue repeatedly and said, you're setting a precedent here that you're going to have to live with if the Congress changes hands. You're not going to be able to tell a Democratic majority that you give 1 million documents to only a Republican Congress, but as to a Democratic Congress, you're going to claim privacy and privilege and all the rest of this. But that's exactly what they've done. What explains that of a career Justice Department official? And, you know, I think James Comey came probably very close to the accurate critique of Rod Rosenstein. He just wasn't strong enough. And you know, someone made the observation, and I don't recall who the writer was, that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. It reveals who you are. And I think for Bill Barr, it has revealed who Bill Barr is. I think for Rod Rosenstein, it has revealed who Rod Rosenstein is. And I think Rod simply wanted his job too much and was willing to make too many accommodations to keep that job. And I think that in Bill Barr, when he was serving with George Herbert Walker Bush, when he was serving with a president of integrity and character and decency, then it kept him tethered. But serving with this unethical president, he has become completely untethered.
And on that, I'm curious, what do you think, when Rod Rosenstein, who was directly involved in the removal of James Comey, then was a fact witness in that part of the obstruction probe, so soon after the Mueller report was finished, was publicly attacking James Comey, who he helped oversee the removal of, did that strike you as inappropriate at a time when the Congress hasn't finished its review of those issues?
I guess what I found most inappropriate is that someone who participated in one of the most important vignettes that the special counsel wrote about might constitute the crime of obstruction. In writing the memo that was used as a pretext for the firing of Comey, that he would participate in the whitewashing of the obstruction, that he would participate in Bill Barr's decision to say there was no obstruction here, that he would stand behind Bill Barr at that press conference. That, to me, was the most offensive and destructive to the rule of law.
Do you think the Congress should call or subpoena Mr. Rosenstein to further explain that very controversial memo, which is the origin of the Mueller probe, in a way?
I think he should be brought before both the Judiciary Committee as well as our own committee, and we are taking steps along that regard.
Well, now I have to ask, what are those steps? Are you telling us today that you have requested Rosenstein testify to the House Intelligence Committee?
I'm not prepared to comment on where we are in terms of specific witnesses, but
I feel like you kind of did, though.
well, our ordinary course of action is we request voluntary compliance of documents and appearance, and that's not forthcoming. We move to subpoena, and
So my last one, I don't want to turn it into a deposition. It's an ideas conference. Would it be reasonable to infer you've already requested a voluntary interview with Mr. Rosenstein?
this does feel like a deposition. It would be more than reasonable to infer that I think it's fully appropriate and for him to come and testify before Congress. And explain what were the circumstances, among other things, what were the circumstances under which you wrote that memo that was used as a pretext for the firing of James Comey? Did you know when you were asked to write that memo, that Comey was going to be fired? Did you know when you were asked to write that memo that Comey was going to be fired for a reason different than the one that you set out in the memo? Why is it you felt that didn't require your recusal from the ultimate decision on obstruction of justice?
And
did you seek an ethics department opinion? Did you follow that opinion?
And doesn't the Mueller report state that Rosenstein knew that Donald Trump was going to fire him and that Russia was the reason he wanted, and he removed that but wrote the memo anyway?
Well, let's have Rosenstein come before the Congress and the American people and articulate exactly what happened, whether he disagrees with Mueller's conclusions, whether he agrees with them, and why it is that he felt that the country could have confidence in his judgment on an issue in which he was a very important witness.
All very interesting and forthright answers. I see zeros here. I want to confirm, does that mean we're out? I'm getting a correct from stage right. If you're like me, you could listen for even longer to Chairman Schiff explain much of these difficult issues around the world and here in the United States with nuance. We are out of time, and I want to be respectful of the time of the next speakers. Please join me in giving a warm welcome and thank you to Congressman Schiff for coming to CAP today.
Thank you.